In Hong Kong, housing prices and rent have always been sky high. That's why every single public housing unit is something people dream of having. Not every flat is truly a place of comfort. Some places, on the surface, look like nothing more than an ordinary apartment. Yet the moment you open the door, you may realize you are not the only one living inside. In the 1980s, Hong Kong was still racing forward with rapid development. Neon lights shone bright. The city drowned in money and nightlife. But behind the glowing lights, countless people struggled quietly in the shadows. Arjun, a new immigrant from India, was one of them. When he first arrived in Hong Kong, he didn't know a single word of Chinese. He had no relatives, no friends. The only way to survive was to take on the hardest, lowest paid labor jobs. By day, he sweated on construction sites. By night, he squeezed into a narrow room inside an old tenement building. His life was bitter, and almost nobody knew his hardships. 7 years passed in this kind of loneliness and struggle. At last, he was granted Hong Kong residency. For Arjun, that meant he could finally apply for public housing, a place that could truly be called his own. When he filled out the application form, he was extra careful, line by line. Chinese words were still unfamiliar to him, so he read through each character one by one, not daring to make a mistake. Then, in the corner of the form, he noticed a small box, Fast Track Approval. His heart stirred. He hesitated for a moment. But finally, he drew a tick in that little box. Half a year later, a miracle happened. Arjun actually received approval for a public housing flat. At that time, most Hong Kong people had to wait 3 or 4 years, sometimes even longer. But he had waited only 6 months. The unit he was assigned wasn't new, but the location was convenient, and the flat itself was not small. For Arjun, living alone in this city, this was already the beginning of the life he had been dreaming of. In the first few days after moving into his new flat, Arjun spent all his time tidying up. The place was filled with cardboard boxes and scattered belongings, a complete mess. Most of the furniture had not been bought yet. He didn't even have a bed, only a thin mat spread out on the floor. The thought of sleeping directly on the hard ground felt unbearable. So for the first few nights, he stayed over at a friend's place instead. A week later, the basic furniture finally arrived. A simple iron bed, a small dining table, 2 wooden chairs, and an old wardrobe. It wasn't comfortable, but it was enough for daily life. Looking at the small flat slowly taking shape, Arjun felt, deep inside, that he had at last found a place to settle down. From that day on, he decided this unit would be his home. Public housing in Hong Kong was very simple. The biggest problem was sound. You could hear almost everything. Neighbors chatting through the walls, chairs dragging across the floor above. Arjun wasn't used to it, but the thought of finally having a place of his own made it worth enduring. On his first night in the flat, the building was quiet and still. After unpacking his things and taking a shower, Arjun lay down on the iron bed to rest. At first, everything seemed normal. But around 3 in the morning, he was jolted awake by a sound. It was the sound of high heels striking the corridor floor. The steps came from far away, slowly approaching his door. And they didn't stop. They walked back and forth, near and far, repeating again and again. Arjun's drowsiness vanished. His eyes grew sharp. At this hour, who would be walking in the corridor? And in high heels, the steps drew closer, echoing just outside. Arjun's heart raced with a mix of curiosity and impulse. He decided to wait until the sound came right to his door. Then he would throw it open and see for himself. At last, the footsteps stopped directly outside. Holding his breath, Arjun pulled the door wide open. The corridor was empty. The cold fluorescent light flickered a few times, and only the wind whispered from the far end. The tapping sound was gone, as if it had never existed at all. Arjun felt a weight pressed down in his chest. He looked into the empty corridor, his throat dry but unable to say a word. Finally, he drew a deep breath, shut the door slowly, and turned back toward his bed. But just as he did, the phone rang, the only telephone in the flat. Its sudden ringing pierced through the silence. Unbearably loud, Arjun frowned, hurried to the desk, and picked up the receiver. "Hello? Who's there?" On the other end, nothing. Only faint, uneven breathing. Arjun tried again. "Hello? Who is it?" Still no reply. After a few seconds, a strange sound came through, like a sharp blade cutting through wood, or a cleaver chopping through meat. Cold and heavy. Arjun's body froze. He listened for a moment longer, his brow furrowing deeper and deeper. Then, without another word, he slammed the phone down. The flat sank back into silence once more. Only the pounding of Arjun's heartbeat echoed in the dark. The next morning, Arjun went downstairs, ready to leave for work. As he passed through the building lobby, he noticed a new notice posted on the bulletin board. Black letters on white paper. It read, "Recently, crime in the area has been on the rise, especially during late hours. All residents are urged to stay alert. Please remember to lock doors and windows before going out or going to sleep, to prevent any incidents." Arjun stopped for a few seconds, quietly staring at the paper. In his mind, he could not help but recall the footsteps in high heels from the night before, and the sound of a knife cutting that had come through the phone. He wondered, could there really be someone in the building with bad intentions? Or could this warning be connected to what he had heard last night? But Arjun quickly pushed the doubts down. He still had to go to work. He didn't have the energy to think about it too much. Arjun worked in Hong Kong as a delivery man, his shifts lasting almost 12 hours a day. From morning until the streets turned quiet at night, he was always on the move. By the time he returned home, it was usually very late. The work was exhausting, but it gave his life a rhythm. After a while, he grew used to it. About 2 weeks after moving into the new flat, one late night, Arjun dragged his tired body back home as usual. But the moment he opened the door, his heart sank. The whole flat was in chaos. Papers and magazines that had once been stacked neatly on the table were scattered all over the floor. Drawers hung open, clothes and belongings tossed in a mess. Even dishes from the kitchen table had fallen and shattered, fragments scattered into the corners. In that instant, only one thought flashed through Arjun's mind. Someone had broken in. He rushed back to the front door to check the lock. But the lock was perfectly intact. Not a single mark of tampering. The windows were also unbroken. No trace at all of forced entry. Arjun's chest tightened with panic. He felt he had to ask someone to confirm what had happened. So he crossed the corridor and knocked on the neighbor's door. After a moment, an old man with a head of white hair opened it. When he saw Arjun, his expression grew complicated. He spoke quickly in heavily accented Cantonese, gesturing with his hand, pointing toward Arjun's flat. Arjun stood there, completely lost. With his limited Chinese, he couldn't understand a single word the old man was saying, but the man's face seemed serious, as if he was trying to warn him. In his eyes was a weight that could not be explained. Arjun didn't dare waste more time. He picked up the phone and called the police. Soon, officers arrived and inspected the flat. But the door lock, the window frames, even the walls, all were intact. No signs of damage at all. They only photographed the mess, took down his statement, and finally left him with one line. "We'll make a record for you." Arjun watched the officers leave. There was no comfort in his heart. The flat around him was still in ruins, and the silence pressed down heavily. He stood alone in the middle of the mess, listening only to the sound of his own breathing, as if the entire flat itself was quietly watching him. Although nothing valuable had been taken, Arjun still spent the whole day cleaning up the mess in his flat. The next morning, he went to a locksmith, had the old lock removed, and replaced it with a newer, more complicated, sturdier one. He quietly told himself, as long as the door is locked, I will be safe. Night fell again. Arjun lay alone on his iron bed, forcing himself to sleep. But at 3 in the morning, the familiar sound returned. The sharp clicking of high heels echoed in the corridor. Step by step, closer and closer, each sound striking against his nerves. Arjun clutched the blanket tightly. This time, he didn't rush to open the door. He held his breath, pretending not to hear. Minutes passed. At last, the footsteps faded, vanishing into the darkness. Arjun let out a long breath, ready to close his eyes again. Suddenly, the phone exploded into the silence. This time he didn't ask any questions. He slammed the phone down. But the phone began ringing again, as if mocking him. Furious, he snatched it up, yanked out the line, and threw it back onto the desk. The room fell silent once more. After several nights of this, Arjun's nerves were stretched to the limit. He grew certain that something would happen again. The next day, he asked his boss to let him leave work early, hoping to get home before dark, to make sure everything was safe. That evening, Arjun hurried back to his floor. As he reached the corridor, something caught his eye. At the far end, right in front of his flat, a shadow was standing. The figure leaned close, as if trying to unlock his door. Arjun's heart leapt. At once, he thought, this is the person who broke into my home before. He shouted, charging forward. The shadow flinched but didn't run. As Arjun drew closer, he saw more clearly. It was a woman, thin, with long hair falling over her shoulders. Gritting his teeth, Arjun pushed himself faster. He was only a few steps away when it happened. The woman didn't turn around. She simply raised her hand slightly, and in the next instant, her body slipped silently through the iron door, disappearing inside the flat. Arjun froze where he stood. His legs gave out beneath him. He stared at his own door, then collapsed to his knees on the cold corridor floor. Sweat and tears poured down together. Not even a scream could escape his throat, only a trembling deep within. In that moment, Arjun finally understood. The mess inside his flat, the late-night phone calls, the footsteps in high heels echoing through the corridor. None of it was the work of thieves. It was something else, something that did not belong to this world. That night, Arjun no longer had the courage to step back into the flat. He wandered outside until dawn. The very next day, he went straight to the government office and applied to give up the unit, choosing to rejoin the long waiting list for another public housing flat. And of course, this time, he did not dare to tick the box marked fast-track approval. But the story did not end there, because the reason this flat became one of the most infamous haunted homes in Hong Kong was tied to a far darker past. Back in the 1980s, this very unit was the site of a shocking crime. The killer was a former police officer. Because of a tangled love affair, he lost control in a fit of rage. Inside that flat, he murdered 2 women with his own hands and left a 3rd woman critically injured. The crime was brutal, bloody, merciless. At the time, newspapers reported the case everywhere, but the details were so horrific that even now, not many people are willing to talk about them. From then on, The unit carried a cursed name. The government continued assigning it to families in need. But after the murder, the first two groups of tenants all abandoned the place within a single month. Their stories varied slightly, but they all described the same kind of terror. At night, footsteps echoing in the corridor, muffled cries of women inside the rooms, and even black shadows moving silently down the hallway. These things were enough to drive every tenant away. As rumors spread, even the neighbors in nearby flats began to move out one by one. The whole floor grew emptier and quieter. The corridor lights flickered and dimmed, and those who stayed behind avoided walking past the cursed door. The government could not ignore this. They decided to investigate, but the method they used was unusual. It was said that the housing department once sent several new recruits to stay inside the unit for a night. 5 young staff members entered with recording equipment and cameras, ready to spend the night there in the middle of summer. By then, the flat was already sealed with heavy chains. No outsider could enter by accident. Yet the moment they stepped inside, they all felt it. A wave of unnatural coldness. It didn't feel like summer at all. One of them later confided to a friend, the flat was shockingly cold, like stepping into an ice cellar. He said his entire body broke out in goosebumps, even with no fan, no air conditioning. His skin felt an icy chill that cut straight to the bone. They kept the recorder running the entire night, and at regular intervals they also took photographs for evidence, although none of them saw a ghost with their own eyes. When they listened back to the tape afterwards, the recording confirmed it. At around 2 or 3 in the morning, there were footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, moving from far to near, wandering back and forth. The photographs were just as strange. Some showed floating points of light. Others captured long, trailing streaks, as if something had moved across the room, without leaving behind a body. The full report was never made public, but the investigation itself became proof for the public. This flat was not just an urban legend. Even the government admitted that the place was unclean. In the end, the authorities made a drastic decision. The unit was completely sealed, the doorway bricked up with cement, turning it into nothing more than an empty number. On paper, the flat still existed, but no one could ever enter it again, and no one would ever live there. And so, this unit became one of the most infamous haunted flats in all of Hong Kong. Even years later, people still claim that late at night, if you walked down that corridor, you could hear the clicking of high heels, the muffled cries of women, or catch a glimpse of a shadow slipping past the corner of the wall. As for Arjun, his story was only one more chapter in this long, twisted legend. He was just another tenant who stayed for a short time, and like all the rest, he could not endure it. He chose to leave. From then on, no one ever lived there again. The flat remained sealed forever, a permanent page in Hong Kong's book of urban legends.